Alright, welcome back for part 27 in our 816 part series on the Gilded Age, apparently. This is actually a topic that's a little bit more near and dear to my heart. That'll be the new immigrants who come to the United States during the Gilded Age. Alright, so let's talk about the new immigrants. Before we talk about who the new immigrants are, we gotta figure out, okay, why do we call them the new immigrants? And we have to distinguish them from a group that were characterized, I guess, against, that we call kind of the old immigrants. We really don't use that term a whole lot, but the term is going to help you see the difference between them and the new immigrants. The old immigrants were the people who came to the United States before the Gilded Age. Their characteristics, they typically came from Northern and Western Europe. So they're coming from Britain, some of the Scandinavian countries. This would also include like Western Germany. Although you have a lot of poor immigrants in this group, you also have a significant percentage, a noticeable percentage, of people who we might consider to be middle and or upper class. Okay, so they're coming over with some means. They're coming over with some money. A lot of these immigrants who come over before the Gilded Age, they also either spoke English, or they knew enough to get by, or they're going to be able to pick it up kind of quickly. So linguistically, they're going to be able to fit in pretty quickly. And they also tended to be Protestant, so they're Christians who are not Catholic. And so a lot of times we will describe them, and people that fit these characteristics, we'll describe them as being WASPs. That stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay, so WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, if you ever see that term. So who are the new immigrants? Well, the new immigrants start showing up during the Gilded Age, and they represent a demographic shift. You're going to start seeing some more of these people starting around 1880. There is a significant increase in the number of these people in the 1890s and into the early 1900s. These new immigrants were from Eastern and Southern Europe. So they're coming from a different place on the European continent, and Europeans know a difference. Okay? These immigrants were pretty much all poor. They're typically poor, so they're coming over with just not much. The clothes they bring with them is kind of it. Another difference is many of these people speak little to no English. They have never had exposure to the English language, and because their languages were so different, not only just the fact you're speaking a different language, but also the sentence structures, verb conjugations, etc., it's going to be more difficult for them to pick up that English language. And what sets them apart in terms of their religion is they're coming over and they're bringing different religious beliefs with them. They're Orthodox Christians. This is another Christian group. They branched off from Catholicism hundreds of years before the Protestant Reformation, but they're very they have a lot of traditions in the Orthodox churches that are just going to be radically different from Protestant churches. You also have a large number of Jewish immigrants, and to Americans, the scariest thing about some of these new immigrants is that they were also Catholic. We are traditionally extremely afraid of Catholic immigrants. The fear was that if you have too many Catholics in the United States, they would ultimately elect a government led by Catholics. And the feeling was that good Catholics listen to and follow the direction of the Pope. So if you have a majority of Catholics as voters. They will elect a Catholic government, and then that government will be run by the Pope. And that sounds bizarre and crazy in 2018, but that was a fear that was predominant and widespread, not only in the 1800s, but through the 1900s as well. So just real quick, some photographs. These are some of the new immigrants. These are people that are coming over. You see they've got their boxes of their clothing. They're carrying their immigration paperwork with them, and you can see just the way they're dressed. It's different. It's not going to be what we think of when we see a bunch of those pictures from the Gilded Age. These photographs right here, these two photographs that I'm going to show you over here on the left side, these are some people we might consider to be some of the old immigrants. This is a Norwegian lady, and so you see her kind of in her traditional dress. This is obviously they're going to wear what they have at home when they're coming over. This is a young lady from a region called Alsace and Lorraine. It's kind of on the border between Germany and France. This is looking a little bit more in the style of what we might think of when we think of the Gilded Age, the 1800s. What do Americans wear? And if you kind of notice these two photos, these people look like they kind of almost fit in. Maybe the Norwegian lady with her outfit maybe wouldn't, but if you change her clothes, she's probably going to look like she fits in. Now over here on the right-hand side, we're going to have some of the new immigrants. This is a lady. She is from Ruthenia. It's in kind of in the border region between Romania and the Ukraine today. And you see her outfit radically different cultural outfit that she has on, and even kind of if you see her face a little bit more dark complected. Compared to this young lady over here. This is a gentleman. He is from Romania. You see a little bit darker hair on top of the thicker facial hair. Okay. This is an Italian woman. Again, darker features. It's one of the characteristics of people that came from Southern Europe. They had darker Mediterranean features. This is a Cossack. He is from kind of the southern Russia, kind of along the steppe in the Russia, Chechnya, Armenia region. But he's a Cossack, and so you can see a little bit difference there with him. And then this is a Greek Orthodox minister. And he's wearing the traditional Greek Orthodox robes that he would wear when he is in church. And so you see he looks, these people all look different from what we think of when we think of people in the 1800s. If you go Google pictures of people from the 1800s, you're not going to see people that look like that. So these new immigrants, the reason they were referred to as the new immigrants is because they looked different. Not only were they demographically different, they also looked different. They sounded different. They acted different. They had different cultures and customs. So those people from Western Europe who, when they moved over here, yes, they were immigrants, but they kind of fit in pretty quickly. New immigrants don't. All right, so once they got here, where did they live? For the United States, for the new immigrants at this point in time in the Gilded Age, there are two main points of entry. So the number one point of entry for people coming to the United States during the Gilded Age was through Ellis Island. You're probably familiar at least with the term Ellis Island. It's there in New York. The new immigrants who came in through Ellis Island typically ended up settling in one of the major cities in the north. So we're talking New York, Pittsburgh, as far west as Chicago. And it was because, they may be coming over as poor, but they could buy a train ticket. And they could ride the railroad out to one of these larger cities. So maybe they go as far as Chicago. But if you came in through Ellis Island, you probably hit the railroad and went to one of the major cities if you didn't stay in New York. You might stay in New York. When they got to these cities, they ended up establishing what we call ethnic neighborhoods. The entire neighborhood, it seems like, is made up of one entire ethnic group. Okay, you at least have a very large percentage of them living in the same area. And the reason you would do that is because, imagine you show up in New York City. There are, 1 million people in New York City. Well, where do you go? You don't speak the language. You speak something totally different. You don't understand anybody. You're kind of wandering through the streets, and all of a sudden you hear somebody over here on the side speaking your language. You run to them for help. I'm new here. What do? They recognize you. They recognize your language. They know you're a countryman. They're gonna help you out. Come with me. Come to my neighborhood. I know of an apartment. It is in my apartment building. Okay. Then when you got there, you wrote home. These new immigrants, they had kind of the classic immigration pattern. Send someone to find a place to live, to find a job, and then write to the rest of the family and say, this is where I am, come here. And so then the rest of the family would show up. And so you would have, entire sections of places that became populated by these ethnic groups. So imagine New York City, one of the neighborhoods that we may have heard of before is Little Italy, because of the number of Italians that moved in there. But you also had Little Russia and Little Romania and all these other little places. This right here, this is a map. It shows New York City in 1910, but it shows, it has color-coded where you have these ethnic neighborhoods of at least 20%. And so, here you have the Austria-Hungarians right here. The pink are going to be just Russian, so you'll have a little Russia. The green, the Irish. The Irish don't fit the typical WASP pattern either. The Italians are in purple, so that's where you're going to find your Little Italy areas. Now, the second major point of immigration for the new immigrants in the Gilded Age is through Galveston, Texas. We may not think of Galveston as kind of a major immigration point. In the early 1900s, it'll be destroyed by a hurricane. But prior to that, it is the second largest point of immigration for the United States from Europe. Those that come in through Galveston, you might still have enough money to ride the train. The train isn't going to run east to west, though. It's going to run north-south. And so if you came in through Galveston, more than likely you settled somewhere in the Midwest. Now, because we don't have a whole lot of major cities in the Midwest, these new immigrants who came in, they don't establish ethnic neighborhoods. They end up establishing what we call ethnic communities. It's the same concept as the ethnic neighborhood, but instead of having, just a neighborhood, a couple blocks, you have an entire community that has a large, significant percentage of this brand new ethnic group that lives there. And so, if you think just in Texas, the cities of New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, huge German populations there. West Texas, Temple, Texas, Ennis, Texas, huge numbers of Czech families that live there. Again, many of them following that classic pattern of, one person moves over, and then when they find a place to live, then they write their relatives and tell their relatives, come here, this is where I'm living. Now, regardless of where these people moved, if they moved to the city and the ethnic neighborhoods, if they moved to the Midwest and the ethnic communities, these new immigrants were able, in many cases, to maintain a lot of their cultural practices. And that's another thing that kind of sets them apart. Because you moved into the neighborhood, you didn't have to learn English. There were enough people around that knew English. They could translate for you, but for the most part, we're living in the neighborhood, doing our business in the neighborhood. They were able to maintain, some of them, their native languages and then their native cultural practices. And while that's a good thing because they're able to keep those things and pass them on, it's also something that Americans didn't like because they saw them as continuing to be different. Now, another group that's moving in here, we don't consider them to be new immigrants. Okay, new immigrants are those Southern and Eastern Europeans. We do have, on the other side of the country, on the West Coast, we have Asian immigrants. Okay? So they're specifically on the West Coast. Some of them might make their way to New York City, but for the most part, this is going to be a West Coast thing. Okay? They're going to come in through the port of entry on the West Coast called Angel Island. It is in San Francisco. And they're going to go through the same process that they go through at Ellis Island. Paperwork processing, checking for disease, whatever. The two main groups of Asian immigrants that come through are the Japanese. Not all of them, of course, but a significant, a noticeable number of the Japanese immigrants were businessmen. Some of the Japanese immigrants that come over figure out that the American economy is looking for things to buy, and they have access to cheaper products that are made in Asia that they can import to the United States, and this is something that's been going on for several hundred years, if you can believe that. There's a great book out there called 1493. You should read it. It's very academic, though, so it's going to be very dry. But whatever, they have access to these goods from Asia that they can import to the United States, and they can earn a lot more money. Because they're businessmen, they're going to have more money. Because they're going to have more money, they're going to be more politically connected, at the very least back in Japan. That will make a difference in a later unit we talk about when we talk about the progressives. The other group of Asian immigrants, the noticeable group of Asian immigrants, are the Chinese. Okay? There's a lot of Chinese workers that move to the United States. Most of them are poor. And their purpose in coming to the United States, for a lot of them, was actually to come to the United States, earn enough money to then go back to China and basically be able to retire at the age of 35 or something like that. Because China's economy was so far behind Western Europe and the United States. If you can come here and work for a couple of years and make what we would consider maybe not a whole lot, to them it was a huge sum. Now a lot of these guys, after being here, they decided to stay. Okay. And just like the new immigrants, they're also going to settle into ethnic neighborhoods. So, maybe you've been to San Francisco or LA or some of these other places, and you go through Chinatown. That's just an ethnic neighborhood. And still they also are able to maintain their cultural practices. So why did they come? What are they looking for? Here's where we're going to see some of our connections. Their push factors. Of course, life is just not as good in their home countries. Whether you're talking about Eastern Europe or Asia, they're facing economic problems. So if I can't make enough money to survive here, I'm going to go somewhere else, somewhere where I can. And the United States is providing that pull factor, the economy. They've heard if you go to the United States, you can make money. There are jobs. There is industry. There are things going on there. Jobs are available because of that rapid industrialization, because of the big businesses that are putting in the factories. They need unskilled labor. And I'm not saying that these immigrants that came over didn't have any skills. I'm saying they don't speak enough English to be able to communicate, look, these are the skills I have, but they need a job, and anybody can be shown how to pull a lever until they're able to pick up enough English to be able to communicate, look, this is what I would rather do. A lot of them, when they come over, when you move to a place, you just kind of have to find a job sometimes. Some of them, their first job is as a strike breaker or a replacement worker. This means unions are not going to like them because they need a job. They're doing things that are counterproductive to unions. Railroads specifically go out and recruit Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants to work on the railroads because they felt that the Americans that would potentially work on the railroads are looking for a better deal. These guys are happy with the deal the railroads are going to give them. In all honesty, the railroads were much happier with their Chinese workers. The Chinese workers did things the Americans didn't. When the railroad would pay them the Chinese workers would all get together and they would kind of pool their money, and one person would go and he would buy supplies, lunch and dinner supplies, and he would buy wide variety of things, kind of as cheaply as he could. That way they could feed everyone. They had a wide variety of a diet, but it kept them healthy. Whereas the Americans would take their money and they'd go to whatever town they were near and they'd spend it all on, booze and foods that we're gonna make them sick later on. The stereotypical, the guy who goes out to the West and all he does is eat beans every day. Well, that was them, because if you eat beans, you save money and then you have money for alcohol. The Chinese didn't do that, and so the Chinese ended up being much more productive workers. Okay? Now, American reactions to these immigrants. There is going to be a rise in something called nativism. Nativism is discrimination against immigrants. Sometimes it's described as a preference for native-born people. That's where we get the term nativism, because we prefer the native-born. You see this over and over again in American history. The one good thing about this topic of nativism is wherever we see a change in immigration patterns, we will also see nativism directed against those immigrants. And the other good thing about it is when I show you, what are the typical arguments here in just a second, they remain the same throughout U.S. history. During the Gilded Age, a lot of unions are going to be part of this nativism stuff. They actively discriminate against immigrants because one of the first jobs immigrants have is strike breakers. Some businesses actively seek out workers who are from these different ethnic backgrounds. Okay? Not just because they will work as scabs and strike breakers and whatever else, but also because since they all speak a different language, it becomes harder and harder for them to communicate. Many of them also have historic ethnic rivalries, and so they won't want to work together. We will work on the factory floor together, but we won't hang out together outside of work. We're not going to make small talk while we're here. And for the businesses, that was a good thing because that helped discourage the formation of unions. So businesses are being pretty savvy here. Now, typical nativist reactions or typical nativist accusations against immigrants, and this is the thing, like I said, you can see it over and over again. Pick an immigrant group at a different time in U.S. history, and this is what we accuse them of. Their accusations were they were taking jobs from American citizens. That's always one of the things we complain about. The theory was that they would work for cheaper because, whatever they're getting here is so much more than what they're getting over there. And so they're going to work for cheaper, and therefore unions would accuse them of keeping wages down. Why? We can't get a pay raise because you are willing to work for so cheap. And then another accusation was they refuse to assimilate. They will not truly become Americans because they won't adopt our language, our customs, our culture, whatever. And like I said, this thing right here, pick the time period, pick the immigrant group. This is not new. These are the things we will always complain about when we either have a shift in immigration demographics or when the economy tanks. If the economy's good, we really don't care as much. It's when the economy tanks, we start looking for somebody to blame. Now, how did all this end up shaking out? Well, nationally, there was a group that formed called the American Protective Association. Their ultimate goal was to stop foreign immigration. Didn't get quite that far. In California and the West Coast, there are going to be these things formed called the Working Man's Party. The Working Man's Party of California ended up having a little bit of political clout behind it. Interestingly enough, it was led by this guy named Dennis Kearney. Dennis Kearney is an Irish immigrant. But he's not worried about Irish immigrants. He's worried about Asian immigrants. And so in California, the Working Men's Party of California, they worked to end Asian immigration, or as they liked to put it, the Yellow Peril. Yeah, fun guys there. In 1882, they are successful. In 1882, Congress passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Its purpose was to ban immigration from China, originally for 10 years. It was later extended, and then finally it was made permanent. Officially, Chinese immigrants were banned from coming to the United States until 1943. Now, not everybody is on board with this idea of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This cartoonist, one of my favorite political cartoonists, Thomas Nast, we've seen a couple things by him. He believed the Chinese Exclusion Act was a mistake, and he's saying as much with this cartoon here, the Chinese Wall around the United States of America. And kind of, everybody knew about the Great Wall of China and whatever, and what are we doing here? We're throwing down the ladder by which they rose. They, referring to these people up here. How did they rise? They rose through immigration. And now they've gotten up here. They're not going to allow these people to come up either. Alright, I hope that was informative. I hope you learned a little bit more about immigration, and especially the new immigrants.